Our Old Testament reading this morning is one of those passages that seem almost ripped from the headlines, especially in the aftermath of the assault on our nation's capital. How many of us have been troubled by the question of true and false prophets or charismatic leaders? And how can we tell who's speaking the truth and who's spreading lies? Perhaps among the most disturbing things we saw in the coverage of the attack on the Capitol, along with the Confederate flags and the noose, were the numerous flags and signs with "Jesus saves" in bold letters and other Christian symbols proudly displayed amidst the crowd. There is a photo that's gone viral of men praying at a 7 or 8 foot cross, a part of the mob calling themselves a Jericho march called by God to bring down the walls of government. Putting religious fervor in the mix with exhortations to fight for our freedoms as Americans can be compelling, especially when proclaimed by prominent preachers and public leaders. These ideas, these feelings will not go away just because there is a new United States president. And to be clear, statistics show that slightly over half, 51% of mainline Protestants, that's us, that includes Episcopalians, agree with the sentiments, if not the actions, of the thousands who marched on the Capitol on January 6th. I would imagine that many of us have neighbors or even family members who also agree with the sentiments, if not the actions, of that angry mob. I know I do. Many who got caught up in that fervor may now be asking themselves, how do I know who to believe after all? And many more are asking, how can people we consider to be good people get sucked into a web of lies? How do any of us tell a true prophet from a false one, especially when both can sound so convincing? In today's passage from Deuteronomy, we hear Moses declaring to the Israelites that God will provide them with a prophet who will come after him, who will be raised up from among their own people. God's own words will be in this prophet's mouth, quote, "who shall speak to them everything I command. And anyone who does not heed the words that the prophet shall speak in my name, I myself, God, will hold accountable. But any prophet who speaks in the name of other gods or presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, that prophet shall die." A dire warning. But it's not always so easy to tell who is who. And we see plenty of false prophets running around today who not only stay alive, but seem to make a profit off the backs of other people. Interestingly, there is one more verse that our lectionary leaves out, but this comes right after our passage today in Deuteronomy, and it's our own pressing question. Moses tells the people, "You may say to yourself, how can we recognize a word that the Lord has not spoken?" And Moses gives the answer, "If a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, but the thing does not take place or prove true, it is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Do not be frightened by it." What could be more timely? Our problem of discerning truthful leaders from false ones then is as old as dirt. There must have been false prophets roaming about all the way back to Moses' time. Otherwise, why would he have issued such a warning? The ancient world, in fact, was swarming with would-be seers and prophets, all of them claiming competing truths. Jesus himself in the Gospel of Matthew warned, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." Given recent events, we as Americans have a heightened awareness of competing truths in our own time, and as well, false prophets hawking conspiracy theories and lies masquerading as so-called alternative facts. All too often, people can get sucked into conspiracy theories and political lies without realizing they've gone down a slippery slope into an alternative universe. In the current media culture in which we all live, it's so easy to fall into a bubble or an echo chamber where only certain ideas are allowed, and these ideas are amplified by repetition until they just feel like they must be true. And those who disagree find themselves canceled by the majority inside that bubble. The bubble is cozy, especially when we're all still hunkering down due to the pandemic. We're lonely, we're disgruntled. And for many of us, this is a time of real economic hardship. The bubble provides a social network and a feeling of belonging that is emotionally compelling. And the core beliefs of the group are held not lightly, but with fervor. People become passionate and are cheered on by others inside the group. And it's so easy to take the first step down the slippery slope. Induction into conspiracy theories like cults doesn't require dramatic efforts to lure people in. Social media researchers have noticed a soft appeal, for example, to the QAnon conspiracy. Women influencers on social media commingle recipes for comfort food, makeup tips, and household advice, along with comments on child abuse and trafficking that would concern any good person, any good mother. And they ask things like, I know it sounds crazy, but what if Q is right? What if there really is a child trafficking ring? Sounds reasonable enough to be concerned and to ask to learn more. And then, what if we ignore this and it turns out to be true? Then the next question down the slippery slope. What if Q is right that the government is trying to cover it up because they're actually the ones doing evil things? There's a deep state they don't want us to know about. As the historian Richard Hofstadter wrote back in the 1960s, there has always been a paranoid streak to American politics. As a nation born out of a revolution against an authoritarian monarchy in 1776, we have passed a certain suspicion against authority down the generations. It shapes our American embrace of individualism and personal freedoms, but it also returns over and over in different generations as a tendency to mistrust institutions and authorities. What bumper stickers did many of us put on our little VW Bugs back in the 1960s? But question authority. Let's be honest. How many of us have at one time or another become swept up in a cause for which we had little evidence but a lot of emotion? Or captivated, at least for a time, by a charismatic, narcissistic person, a politician, a celebrity, even a priest. So when this seed of the deep state is planted in people's minds, wrapped in the natural concern for the safety of children, it's easy to take the next step down the slippery slope and post on Twitter or Facebook with the hashtags QAnon, Deep State, or even the seemingly benign hashtag Save the Children. When this anti-authoritarian passion is conjoined with another, the fervor of self-appointed, heavily armed militias organizing under the banner of constitutional rights to free speech and to bear arms, and with groups of white supremacists, both long-standing and new, a mob mentality breaks out. All kinds of long-simmering resentments and fears can come bubbling up when they are given approval by a strong leader, adding fuel to the fire. When a charismatic public leader appears to give permission to this rhetoric of rebellion, this can be the final catalyst that brings the disparate anti-authoritarian groups together to form an armed rebellion. The storming of the Capitol on January 6th, seen through this lens, should not have been a surprise. There was a fuse ready to be lit and explode into violence. And the scariest thing is that once conspiracy theories take root, they are almost impossible to dislodge. Logically, it's impossible to prove a negative. And there's always the lingering question in the face of all evidence to the contrary. But what if QAnon, the Stop the Steal movement, the right-wing politician or preacher is right? What if? How can we know that these prophets are false when it feels so good to be wrapped up in such a seemingly righteous, patriotic cause? In our scripture from Deuteronomy today, Moses doesn't give people a cheat sheet to know the difference, simply an appeal to evidence. What proves actually to be true? But he also gives them something profound as a moral compass. He gives them the 10 Commandments, which spell out the foundations of a just society that promotes the love of God and neighbor. And in the passage in Matthew that I quoted earlier, Jesus also gives us a kind of evidence-based method for telling which prophets are telling the truth and which ones are not. Jesus says, "You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs or thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. Thus you will know them by their fruits." Now, as in ancient times, we can tell good prophets from false ones, not only by what they say, but especially by their whole character and what they do. What are the fruits of false prophets and conspiracy theories that they promote? Sometimes just sheer disappointment or disillusionment, or sowing confusion or fear. Almost always divisiveness and a demand for absolute loyalty and obedience, however subtly disguised, and sometimes outright violence, as we have so recently witnessed to our horror. What are the fruits of good prophets and the causes they promote? Who's serving and fighting for the poor, for communities that are disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic, by health disparities, by climate degradation? Who enters into relationships straightforwardly, without pretense or guile, without cynically exploiting others for their own benefit, like a wolf in sheep's clothing? We are all tested by a consistent call in both the Old and New Testaments to love and do justice, and to care for those who suffer. In the words of the prophet Micah, what does the Lord require of us all but to love justice, to do kindness, and to walk humbly with our God? And as Jesus sums up the law, also quoting Deuteronomy and Leviticus, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." So finally, to the question of people we know who are espousing false prophecies, can't we just argue someone out of a firmly held, but we think delusional belief? Probably not. Not even when they are close friends or family. But perhaps the way we ourselves speak and the ways we spend our lives in the service of others will speak louder than a shouting match about opposing beliefs. By their fruits ye shall know them. What do other people see in our actions? Do they see a willingness to try to do our best to enact love for others, justice for the suffering and the oppressed, and care, as one of our Episcopal Eucharistic prayers puts it, for this fragile earth, our island home? We know the truth of the gospel, the good news of God's love and liberation for all people equally. How would others describe the fruits of our lives? In her latest unofficial letter to our diocese, our bishop assistant Mary Glasspool wrote this great statement: "Jesus not only spoke the truth, he embodied the truth through the way in which he lived his entire life. Truth is a person who confronts us with God." Let's ask ourselves this question: how are we living into that truth? Amen.